In 2008, when Oxfordshire Economic Partnership launched a series of seminars called Horizons and Futures that ran for, I think it was 2.5, nearly 3 years, we started with an event called The World in 2025. And at that time, we were very lucky to have James Ellis come along and talk to us about the views at something of a distance, if you like, give us a bit of wider perspective than simply the local view. What James has brought to us over that time has been a continuing friendship, a continuing guiding hand, and certainly continuing information, helping us to think about some of the things that affect us, even when they're far away. And it's kind of grasping what's going on and what are the things that are coming toward us that allow us, perhaps, as businesses, to make some important decisions. Well, updating that today, I've asked James if he would join us and take a look at the world 2025 in an updated view and some of the things that have impacted us. So, without further ado, I know most of you know James. I'd like to welcome and thank for coming along, James Ellis. James? Cheers.
I'll just find a place to put my coffee, if I may. So, very honored to be with you. I think that it's true that I don't think I could have imagined that when I'd been speaking to you, it was next door, about the world in 2025, that then a little bit more than 3 years, then I would be back and then talking about something else, but updating this presentation. Well, I call it Global Trends 2030, and I'll explain why we've gone 5 years further on. But its implications for UK business, obviously, for businesses here in Oxfordshire being the specific focus. I thought, as always with these things, it's a good idea to start with the contents. At least this is what my brain has allowed me to provide in terms of this presentation, and I'll try and add 1 or 2 things, a little bit of color as we go along from some of the things that I've been doing. So this is anyway the presentation as it's come through the day. We've been working on it, and thanks to modern technology, it's all here. So what you're going to have is an introduction, then looking at Global Trends 2030, background to that, information sources. There are a few more information sources than I had when I first gave you the presentation, because that was on the basis of one document which we had done within a thing called the European Ideas Network. And out of these information sources, 3 major indicators, then implications for UK Oxfordshire businesses on 3 major areas which I've selected, which I think are illustrative of these kind of things in the global trends. Then picking up on how to encourage growth in the UK, it obviously was not without notice that you had this big CEO summit organized by the Times with ideas coming from the CEOs. But how do you get growth? It's a really big question here, this side of the channel, this side of the Atlantic, and the other side of the Atlantic, to know how we are going to match the Chinese and the Indians, who seem to, with ease, be in double-digit growth figures, to the extent you're not going to predict what it's actually going to look like, but it's risky. We can't even predict what's going to happen in the months ahead, and that is actually very true. If you think about when I came here in 2008, I wasn't talking about Lehman Brothers, the financial tsunami which has hit us. These are things which there's an unpredictability. So I think what you can't do is to be specific, but what you can look at, this is what I'm trying to indulge in this evening, is looking at major trends underway in a rapidly changing world. And identifying the trends underway does enable policymakers to make better decisions for the future. And these longer-term trends are relevant for us in Europe, the UK, Buckinghamshire, and Oxfordshire. The question, of course, about predicting trends, and I should say that in doing this, Frank, it's really a great honor for me to be here to launch this thing for Oxfordshire Business First, because I know we've been friends and I know we've been doing this, but you could have selected all kinds of different types of people to do this for you. But I'm honored to be with you, and I wish you all the best in what I think is a really important and essential initiative. And that'll come through in the kind of things where I think business views are really going to be essential in mobilizing politicians to understand the kinds of real challenges which are out there, and the businesses are best qualified, I think, to do that. So looking at these things, I thought that looking at trends, of course, you can always try to predict things. And just a quote I came across by Orson Welles in The Third Man, it's 1949, one of those classic films. He's just looking back at history and seeing where creativity came from. And he said, in Italy for 30 years under the Borgias, they had warfare, terror, murder, and bloodshed, but they produced Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and the Renaissance. In Switzerland, I hope there aren't any Swiss here, they had brotherly love, they had 500 years of democracy and peace, and what did that produce? So in terms of the reason of quoting that one, when there's real turbulence, there are things which we can be really creative and take opportunities which mightn't otherwise be there. So here in Global Trends 2030, there are 4 sources of information which I'm using for putting together this kind of image in front of you today. One is an exercise on Global Governance 2025. That was a joint US-EU policy planners initiative, going around the globe, talking with the Chinese, Indians, and others, to be able to look at thinking what is the kind of challenges out there. I was on 90% of those trips to India, to Russia, to the Russian Academy of Sciences and others, and not at any stage did any of those BRIC countries ask us, why are the US and the EU doing this together? Actually, they mostly said, why have you taken so much time to get here? Then on the second one, which I'll look at each of these in just a bit of color for you. Global Trends 2030, that is an exercise which the Americans are now doing for November 2012 for the incoming US president. There was a meeting 3 weeks ago near Washington done by the policy planners of the National Security Council, National Intelligence Council. 70 people there. I was one of them, so I can give you the informal minutes of that meeting. That's not published yet, but it just makes really interesting reading. And the next one is the Global Trends 2030. That I'll come to in a moment. But it was very interesting. I just come to the Street Global Outlook from the Russian Academy of Sciences. This is MMO. You know, the Russian 2012 looks pretty pessimistic with the problems that they have of population and the average age, which is about 55. Most of them drink themselves to death, it seems. But anyway, they have somewhat kind of optimistic kind of outlook here. The point I want to make is that here you have beginnings of a global community of people looking at long-term trends. They launched that document not in Moscow, but in Washington 3 weeks ago. Just to show you, it wasn't the kind of world that I was born in, but it's the kind of world which is coming now. So if you have a look at each of these things, just a little bit of an illustration here. I think it's getting hot here. I don't mind. I don't want you to open out the window, but of course that's going to cause me problems with my technical stuff, but I won't worry about that. I'll take that out. So what you see from the document I was telling you about, which was discussed 3 weeks ago, 3 basic trends which are of interest. Great rebalancing, it's rising developing economies, coupling with increasing urbanization and a massive shift of influence from west to east, influence of demography. While more mature societies, such as our aging societies, youth bulges in many developing countries will begin to decline by 2030, setting the stage for what's called a demographic bonus of workers in their 20s and 30s. Life expectancy will continue to increase. That's the good news. The bad news is just how we're going to be capable of being competitive. Impact of technology, huge. This is what's really the big thing. It's the most, I think you can see there, the number one independent variable shaping our global future. ICT will continue to be transformative, improving ecosystems, is a range of different things. And I guess with Arab Spring, one can know perfectly well how difficult it is going to govern those populations which don't want to be run by a single individual. If you look at then, if from the American side of things, European one, you might say, well, where the hell is this coming from? Well, what we're designing with the help of the Americans and the National Intelligence Council on the basis of a budget amendment which I tabled to the EU budget back in 2009 was to create a similar type system. So what we're doing is to create an interinstitutional system within the EU in organization called ESPAS. It's the European Strategic and Policy Analysis System, where I presented that to the US meeting 3 weeks ago, and where we are at the process of creating a document which will come out in the autumn time in November, seen from a European perspective, what are the challenges out there 2030? And secondly, more important, is what are actually the challenges and options for the EU going from 2014 to 2019 to cope with these challenges which are out there. And here you have similar types of things, just interesting, put in a different type of way. Of trends in power, the global system looks more a polycentric system, plurality of actors, many actors, without one major global power. That's probably still going to be the US. Diffusion of state power, enhancement of networks, major cities, certainly more empowerment of individuals to express their views. That's really important, by the way, for politicians to understand they can't run their machines as they might wish to do in the political parties, I suspect, for any long term in the future, because people just create their own political parties and put them on the net and run them as they wish. By the way, that's an interesting example. In the European Parliament, we have very diffuse kind of thing. We have more than 150 different political parties in the European Parliament from 27 countries. One guy who I was with this week is from the Pirate Party in Sweden, who was elected solely on the basis of intellectual property and the problems on that. You can actually raise this. Anyway, this is just an interesting thing of how power is going to change. Trends in security and sustainable development. Secondly, improbability of major wars. More likely, probably move to soft rather than hardware. But likelihood of internal context, humanitarian urgencies, you can see Libya and other things like that. It's always a big question. I mean, why do we go into Libya and not into Syria? Big kind of political question. I guess we'll run out of resources. Resource scarcities will prevail. That's really important on water and energy. Poverty and inequality will remain a major problem. And then lastly, and not least, as I was mentioning, there's a growing sense of common humanity in the information age, helped by social network generation, but it gives real dilemmas about representative democracy.